I'm done. You owe over 10 grand in rent. I can't keep carrying this.
The tenant explained he was still looking for somewhere to move, but the market wasn't easy. The landlord said he'd been hearing the same excuse for months. After 5 years in the flat, the tenant felt settled. The landlord pointed out that 3 of those 5 years included rent being paid. The last 14 months did not. The landlord said he had already applied to court for eviction. The tenant was refusing to move until he found somewhere that suited him. The tenant pointed out that this would take months.
So your plan is to stay here rent-free until a judge forces you out?
I'm staying until I am ready to move.
This was an exchange between a landlord and a tenant, and it didn't happen at the start of a tenancy. It happened when rent arrears started to accrue. What happens when a tenant stops paying rent? Not for a month, not for 2, but long enough for the arrears to build into thousands. And how does this impact the landlord? Welcome to Tenancy Talk. Identifying details have been changed. The tenancy was without issue. It started as a straightforward tenancy. The tenant had been in the property for years. Rent was being paid. There had been no problems. Nothing about it suggested it would end like this. Then a rent increase was introduced. £50. Not a dramatic jump, or so the landlord thought. Not out of line with what's been happening across the private rental market. But the tenant decided to stop paying his rent. The tenant didn't accept the rent increase. Not because they couldn't pay, but because they didn't agree with it. They described it as principle, and from that point on, the rent stopped.
So your plan is to stay here rent-free until a judge forces you out?
I'm staying until I'm ready to move.
Fine, then I'll see you in court.
1 month passed, then another, then 6, then 12. By the time the landlord sent that message, the arrears had reached around £10,000. The tenant's position that a £50 rent increase justified 14 months of non-payment of rent is not a legal argument. What is legally accurate for an eviction to take place, a court order is required. And the situation shifts entirely, because while the rent stopped, everything else didn't. The mortgage still had to be paid. The insurance still had to be paid. The responsibility for that property didn't disappear. It shifted, fully, onto the landlord. Before legal steps were taken, there were attempts to resolve it. Payment plans were offered, time was given. There was an effort to avoid escalation. But the tenant didn't accept those terms, and the position became clear. I'll leave when I find somewhere suitable. At that point, the landlord decided to take court action and makes an application for possession of his property to the county courts. Because in England, no matter how much rent is owed, a landlord cannot simply remove a tenant, even after months of non-payment, even after a year. Under the Protection from Eviction Act 1977, forcing a tenant out without a court order is a criminal offence. Changing the locks, removing belongings, turning up and demanding they leave, all of it crosses the line into illegal eviction. The landlord must apply to the county court to obtain a court order. There are different routes. In some cases, landlords have used Section 21, often described as a no-fault eviction process that allows possession without proving wrongdoing. In others, they rely on Section 8, which requires specific legal grounds, such as rent arrears. We don't know which route was taken in this case, but we do know this. The choice of serving a Section 21 notice is about to disappear. From the 1st of May 2026, under the Renters' Rights Act 2025, Section 21 will be abolished. That means a landlord will be required to provide details of the breach of tenancy conditions. From that point on, every landlord, in every case, will have to rely on Section 8 and prove their grounds. In rent arrears cases, that matters, because under the Housing Act 1988, Section 8 grounds for possession require evidence. Unlike Section 21, this shift should not be underestimated. If a landlord serves a notice on mandatory grounds, which means if the legal requirements are met, possession must be granted. Arrears must reach a defined threshold. Currently, that's 2 months. Under the new system, it increases to 3, and the notice period extends. So, in a situation like this, Understanding the legal requirements to gain possession is key, as an incorrect notice, insufficient or inaccurate evidence will lead to delay. Registered providers, for example, housing associations, typically have dedicated in-house income collection teams focused solely on arrears management. They often have established links with agencies like the DWP, allowing earlier intervention and structured repayment pathways. Tenants may also receive more coordinated support alongside enforcement, including welfare and budgeting assistance. Private landlords, by contrast, are usually managing arrears alone, without the same access to systems, support, or institutional leverage. Arrears increase, exposure increases, pressure increases, and once the legal process begins, it doesn't move quickly. From the point where rent stops to the point where a property is actually repossessed can take some time, often months. Unlike Section 21, where the court is mainly checking the notice, a Section 8 claim is much less predictable. A lot depends on the grounds being used, especially where discretionary grounds are involved. Even with significant arrears, the case can be adjourned, the tenant can defend it, and the court might grant a suspended possession order instead of outright possession. That means the tenant stays in the property, usually on terms to repay the arrears. So going to court doesn't automatically mean the tenant will be evicted. It can extend the timeline and increase costs, and still leave the landlord without possession at that stage, even when a court grants possession. That isn't the end. The tenant still doesn't have to leave immediately. Enforcement is required. Bailiffs or High Court enforcement officers. Appointments have to be scheduled. Access has to be gained. And each step adds more delay. According to enforcement data, by the time a landlord reaches that stage, the average financial loss is around £12,000. In some cases, significantly more. That figure isn't just unpaid rent, it's time, it's legal cost. It's the reality of carrying a property without income. Now place this case into the wider system. Across England, over 1.3 million households are on social housing waiting lists. At the same time, private rents have risen by around 8% in the past year. Demand is high, supply is tightening. And within that system, disputes like this don't sit in isolation, because this wasn't a case of sudden hardship. It wasn't a missed payment that spiraled. It was a decision, a disagreement over £50, that became 14 months of non-payment. And as time passed, without early intervention, the arrears built into the thousands. And this is where the real-life consequences take hold. The law is designed to provide protection, and that protection matters. But it also means that when things go wrong, they take time to resolve. The landlord in this case absorbs the cost. Back in that exchange, the landlord asks a direct question. So you're going to stay here without paying rent until a court forces you out? The answer is simple. Yes. And the response that follows reflects the only route left. Then I'll see you in court. Eventually, the process will play out. A possession order will be granted. Enforcement will take place. The tenant will leave. But that isn't where this ends, because after this experience, the landlord is selling the property, leaving the rental market entirely. And that decision doesn't just affect one tenancy, it feeds into something much bigger. Fewer landlords, fewer properties, more pressure on a system already stretched. So return to the question, what happens when a tenant stops paying rent? Not for a month, not for 2, but long enough for the arrears to build into thousands. And with Section 21 ending, will we see more cases like this? This isn't just a case of landlord and tenant. It's what happens when legal process, pressure on the courts, and real lives collide. Cases like these don't fit the usual narratives. The reality is more complex, and it doesn't end where the headlines do. Thank you for watching Tenancy Talk. If you want clear, balanced insight into tenancy management issues and the reality behind the headlines, subscribe to the channel.